This is part 2 in my review of the foundational principles of exercise. If you haven't watched part 1 already, make sure that you do, because then this one will make a lot more sense. So without further ado, here we go. Under the category of transfer of adaptations, there are two first principles. One is the principle of specificity, and the other the principle of initial values. The principle of specificity states that adaptations to training can be specific to the muscle action, which means isometric contractions where the joint isn't moving, concentric contractions, which is the lifting portion of a movement, and eccentric contractions, which is the lowering portion of a movement. Movement speed, range of motion, the muscle groups that are being trained, the energy systems involved, such as the phosphocreatine, glycolytic, or aerobic energy system, and the intensity and volume of training. But it's also important to state, and it's actually the reason why I grouped the principle of specificity and initial values together under the umbrella of transfer of adaptations, that because strength is the underlying mechanism for many adaptations, you also have to take into consideration that there's a transfer effect among the various adaptations. What I mean more specifically, pun intended, is that on a continuum of fitness, with one end being weak and deconditioned or beginner range of fitness, and the other end being the advanced and elite end of the fitness continuum, the lower your level of fitness, the more likely there's going to be a transfer of adaptations over to specific tasks. For instance, someone who's on the lower end of the fitness continuum can improve things like squatting, deadlifting, and even things like sprinting or their overall aerobic capacity just by engaging in a strength training program, and even just by engaging in a machine-based strength training program. And the reason why is because increasing strength and overall conditioning will increase the function or functional capabilities for approximately the 80% of the population that isn't even meeting the minimum guidelines for strength training and aerobic exercise, and for the percent of the population that is strength training and meeting the minimum guidelines, but isn't on an efficient, effective, and progressive program, which still applies to a lot of people. But as you move up the fitness level continuum into the intermediate and especially the advanced and elite categories, it becomes that much more important to be specific with your training in order to see continued gains. So the principle of specificity is valid, but it tends to apply more to those on the higher end of the fitness continuum. And because of that, it's a bit of a myth that you have to be specific with your training or with your exercise selection in order to see adaptations or to see improvement. And then moving on to the principle of initial values, which is a principle that a lot of people have never heard of. If you look at the definition, it backs up everything that I just said. And individuals with lower levels of fitness have the greatest capacity for improvement and commonly have a greater transfer effect from general strength and conditioning to specific tasks. So there's a huge amount of research that shows this across a wide spectrum of populations, from the general public to youth athletes and even intermediate level athletes across most sports. You can really sum these two principles up by making sure that you set a general foundation of strength and conditioning through the use of primary exercises like squats, deadlifts, multi-directional lunges, push, press, and rotate. And yes, you should include specific exercises as well, but keep in mind that there is a transfer effect and that specificity doesn't apply equally across the entire fitness continuum. Moving on to the next category, consistency, there are two laws or principles: the principle of reversibility, and the next one, while it's not technically a law or a principle, it is extremely important to know. It's common sense for most people, and it's called the 10% rule. The principle of reversibility states that inadequate training or the cessation of training results in loss of beneficial fitness and performance adaptations. So all that means is, and it's related to a concept called the regression to the mean. that let's say, for example, you haven't been exercising and you have a beginner level of fitness, whether it's strength or aerobic, and then you decide to start up on both a strength training and an aerobic program. Your strength and aerobic fitness will begin at some baseline level. Because you've increased your frequency from not exercising at all to something, and because you've increased your volume and intensity from not exercising at all to doing something, even on an inefficiently designed program, your strength and aerobic capacity is going to increase. And if you stay consistent for a while, it'll continue to increase at least up to some point. But if you begin to diminish something like your frequency and or your volume and intensity, then while you may go into a maintenance phase for 2, 3, or 4 weeks from an aerobic capacity standpoint, and maybe a little bit longer from a strength standpoint, it won't be long before you see a reversal, and your strength and aerobic capacity will begin to regress towards the mean, or to whatever your baseline was to begin with. And obviously, this reversal is going to happen much more quickly if you completely stop training. But I also like to point out to people that this applies to flexibility as well. Flexibility is a component of fitness, which means you can train it. The reason why it gets confusing to some people, or why there's a segment of the population that thinks flexibility doesn't work, is because there are some people, unlike me, who have been blessed with normal range of motion in their joints and or they're hypermobile in some joints. With the point being that some people, just from a genetic standpoint, don't really need to stretch. But for those of us like me who are tight, or who are at least tight in some joints, this principle of reversibility applies to flexibility just as much as it applies to strength and aerobic training. In the sense that if we begin a flexibility program and our frequency went from 0 to 2, 3, 4 days a week, our volume went from 0 to X amount of sets per week, and obviously the same thing happened with our intensity, we're going to see improvements in flexibility as long as while we're stretching, we stretch to the first end range of motion, either relax mentally or perform some sort of PNF style of stretching where the muscle contracts and then relaxes, and then find a second end range of motion. So as long as that is occurring and we're signaling the body to increase its range of motion, then flexibility training is going to work for anyone, and they will see improvements in joint range of motion. But then those improvements are going to begin to regress to the mean if they either reduce their frequency, volume, and intensity, or completely stop. So this principle is a pretty common sense and simple principle that basically states the need to be consistent, and it applies to flexibility as well for those of us who were cursed with tight genetics. And then moving to the next one in this category, the 10% rule. It just states to reduce the risk of injury, start with a safe foundation and progress in small, tolerable increments, preferably no more than 10% per week in load lifted, volume, intensity, and or session duration. And while it's not written in stone that it needs to be exactly 10%, for some people it could be as little as 5%, for others it might be 15, 20, or 25%. So don't get caught up in the number. Instead, get caught up in the fact that it's just smart to begin a program by finding your baseline capacity, and then just make sure that you progress over time in small, tolerable increments, because by doing so, you'll reduce the risk of injury. And then moving to the last category, which is accountability. And again, this is not a law or a principle, although I'm so heavily biased towards this that I think it should be. To properly track frequency, volume, intensity, progression, regression, rate of perceived effort or exertion, changes in order of exercise, choice of exercise, and rest between sets, you have to keep training logs. It's extremely unfortunate and mind-boggling to me that in a lot of the health club world, you're considered a rookie if you keep training logs, and keeping logs is frowned upon. When the truth is, it should be the exact opposite. It's impossible to be able to properly track those variables for every single client with every single session. And it's also part of the code of ethics for pretty much every fitness certifying organization that you must keep training logs for legal purposes. So if you aren't keeping training logs, you're doing your client a disservice. And even from just an individual standpoint, we should be keeping training logs for ourselves, because not only will it track these variables, but can also act as a diary. And we can look back over the course of time, see how we progressed as a means of motivation. And I'm also a believer in not only recording things like exercise selection in the scope of a session, how many sets you performed, how many repetitions per set, the loads and the rest periods, and even the RPE for each set. But also record, like you would in a diary, how you felt that day. Because the way you feel going into the session many times will affect the session itself. And when you record it, it serves the purpose of when you look back on it sometime down the road, it'll make a lot more sense as to why you had a good day or maybe a not so good day. Because you can include things on your log, such as how you felt, how you slept the night before, the time of the day that you exercised, maybe even what and how much you ate prior to the workout. And all these details can be really helpful within the scope of an overall program. So combined with the categories and the principles from part 1 of this series, these are the primary laws that govern exercise. And they're basically telling you to make sure that you include variety, but not so much that you go overboard, because too much variety can also lead to an inability for the central nervous system to be able to optimally adapt and increase the risk of diminishing returns as well. So with resistance training, you want to revolve your program around the primary exercises and make sure that there's a method to the madness with the insertion of your assistance exercises. And then make sure that you're always trying to progress, or at the very least, try to progress out of a beginner range of strength. Everyone should aspire to get out of beginner range. For safety, progress in small tolerable increments. Make sure you're putting in the effort, whether it's with strength training or with aerobic exercise, because there's plenty of research that also supports that it's possible to meet the minimum guidelines for exercise with both strength and aerobic training and still be considered unfit. Because while fitness is frequency and volume or duration dependent, it's also very much intensity dependent. So if your program lacks the intensity, which it does for many people, such as those who are just on a walking program and never go at an intensity above a low to moderate walk, or for people who go in strength train, but they're always lifting light weights, the frequency and volume may be there, but the effort is lacking, and you won't reap the benefits of your program. You also have to make sure that you're consistent, so that you don't have a reversal of your adaptations. Hold yourself accountable, and a primary way to do that is by keeping training logs. And lastly, understand that while it's true that there needs to be specificity in resistance training, don't stray away from the primary exercises, because there is a transfer of adaptations, and they will transfer over to tasks, whether it's activities of daily living, military tasks, and also sports performance. So that wraps up my review on the foundational principles of exercise. I'd highly suggest that you get to know them better, look them up on the internet, become increasingly familiar with them so that you know them like you know your middle name. Because in the end, it's going to really help you with getting the most out of your program or the design of program for others if you happen to be a coach. It'll keep the importance of the basics in the front of your mind, and it'll keep you from being duped by all the deception that's out there. So I hope you enjoyed this, and I'll see you in the next one.